It's a thought that lingers like an echo, the faces we saw on the silver screen, the voices that shaped our culture, the stars that were adored by millions. For years, they embodied the American dream, but what if behind the cameras things weren't as they seemed? What if some of these beloved Hollywood icons secretly held a deep disdain for the very country that gave them everything? Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, had an uncanny ability to read through the facade. He knew which stars genuinely loved America and which ones were playing a part for the cameras. And behind the scenes, he wasn't afraid to speak the truth. Johnny, who interviewed thousands of Hollywood legends during his reign, had a knack for making people feel at ease, which often led them to reveal more than they intended. They'd wave the flag for the cameras, but once the lights dimmed, their true feelings about America would come to light. And Johnny Carson wasn't one to hold back. He knew who took from America and then turned their backs when it suited them. Take Charlie Chaplin, for example. The man who made the world laugh with his silent films, who became an international sensation, never bothered to become an American citizen, despite living here for decades. Chaplin's relationship with the U.S. soured over time, his controversial political views becoming harder to ignore. He was among the first that Carson would point to when talking about celebrities who benefited from America, and then criticized it. Chaplin's anti-fascist film The Great Dictator made waves in 1940. But his increasing support for communist sympathies during the Red Scare soon had the government eyeing him. By the early 50s, Chaplin found himself in a showdown with the U.S. government. When the authorities revoked his re-entry permit in 1952, Chaplin's decision to settle in Switzerland and declare himself a victim of lies and propaganda marked a permanent break. Carson, who once admired Chaplin, now saw him as a cautionary tale, a man who'd used everything America had to offer and then spat on it when it no longer suited him. Then there was Jane Fonda, Hollywood royalty, daughter of the beloved Henry Fonda. But her actions during the Vietnam War earned her a reputation that would stick with her forever. The image of her sitting on an anti-aircraft gun in North Vietnam, a photo that haunted her for years, earned her the infamous nickname, Hanoi Jane. Carson, always the professional, remained polite on camera, but off-screen, he was deeply troubled. Fonda's refusal to acknowledge the complexities of the war, her willingness to offer propaganda for the enemy, felt like a betrayal to many. Carson, like so many others, couldn't forget her actions. Fonda later expressed regret for her choices, but by then the damage was done. For Carson, she was the embodiment of a star who used her American fame to undermine the very nation that gave her that platform. The image of her smiling on Carson's couch could never erase the memories of her actions. Marlon Brando was another who left Carson scratching his head. Brando revolutionized acting, but his disdain for America's politics and values seemed to overshadow his immense talent. Brando's refusal to accept his Oscar in 1973, sending a Native American activist in his place, was just the tip of the iceberg. To Carson, it was more than just an act of protest. It was Brando grandstanding on America's biggest stage, using the Academy Awards to shame the country that had made him a star. Carson had no issue with political engagement, but Brando's actions felt more like a personal vendetta against the very system that had given him everything. Then there was Vanessa Redgrave, a British actress, not even American, who came to Hollywood, made her fortune, and yet continuously criticized the very country providing her with those opportunities. Her outspoken support of the Palestine Liberation Organization and her controversial comments at the 1978 Academy Awards left many Americans fuming. Redgrave's comments felt like a slap in the face to the country that had allowed her to rise to fame, and Carson, who respected free speech, couldn't ignore the hypocrisy of it all. To him, she was the picture of someone who reveled in American wealth while condemning American values. Paul Robeson, an extraordinary talent, became a tragic figure. A celebrated African-American singer and actor, Robeson's fierce fight against racism was admirable, but his admiration for the Soviet system and refusal to criticize Stalin made him a polarizing figure. Johnny respected Robeson's talent, but couldn't reconcile his embrace of an oppressive regime. Carson saw Robeson's story as a moral dilemma. A man who, because of the injustices he faced in America, turned to a system that stood in direct opposition to the country's values of freedom and democracy. Richard Burton, the dashing Welsh actor, was another star who didn't hide his contempt for America. While his relationship with Elizabeth Taylor captured headlines, his disdain for American culture and values was often evident. Burton took American dollars while scoffing at the very culture that had made him famous. He'd mock the country's shallowness, its obsession with materialism, and its lack of history, yet he was more than happy to take part in its Hollywood machine. Johnny saw through that act, and to him, Burton was just another example of a star who used America while looking down on it. And lastly, Orson Welles, a man of unparalleled talent and vision. But Welles had his own brand of anti-American sentiment, often questioning the nation's values, even as he continued to benefit from its film industry. To Carson, Welles represented the complexity of celebrity, someone who could criticize America's flaws while still thriving within its system. But as time went on, Carson couldn't shake the feeling that Welles's critiques went beyond constructive criticism and into something more unsettling. These stars, who built their careers and fortunes on American soil, were seen by Johnny Carson as the perfect examples of Hollywood hypocrisy. They benefited from the country's wealth, but their disdain for its values left a bitter taste. For Carson, the question wasn't about whether they had the right to criticize. It was about the deeper sense of ingratitude. These celebrities had everything because of America, and yet, many of them seemed to resent the very country that had given them everything. Each one of them, in their own way, told a story of fame, power, and rebellion. But in Carson's eyes, they also told a story of something darker, stars who built their lives in America, yet turned their backs on it when it was most convenient. Orson Welles, his name alone conjures images of genius, innovation, and cinematic brilliance. From Citizen Kane to War of the Worlds, Welles changed the very fabric of American entertainment. But as time passed, his feelings about the very country that had made him a star began to shift. Johnny Carson, ever the perceptive observer, noticed this transformation. What was once a boy wonder heralded for his groundbreaking work had turned into a man harboring a deep-seated resentment toward the system that had elevated him. Johnny often remarked that Welles loved power, but not the country that gave it to him. Their interviews were always a fascinating blend of intellectual sparring and charm. Yet Carson couldn't help but feel that Welles had grown disillusioned with America. Once the young, bright-eyed innovator, Welles became disenchanted after a series of career setbacks. Despite his extraordinary early success, Hollywood had rejected him, or at least that's how he saw it. After Citizen Kane, one of the most critically acclaimed films in history, he struggled to regain his footing in an industry that now felt more interested in profits than artistic vision. Living in Europe for much of his later life, Welles became increasingly vocal about his frustrations with the U.S. He lashed out at everything from corporate greed to racial inequality. But Carson, though sympathetic, felt that Welles had crossed a line. What started as constructive criticism began to morph into a blanket condemnation of the country itself. As Welles ranted about America's commercialism and anti-intellectualism, Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that Welles was ungrateful. A man who had been given unparalleled creative freedom and opportunity, yet used that platform to tear down the very system that enabled his rise. Jean Seber's story was one of tragedy, and it may have been the one that most deeply affected Carson. Born in the heartland of Iowa, Seberg's rise to stardom was meteoric, a young actress with both American and French audiences at her feet. But it was her political activism and her outspoken support for the Black Panther Party that would make her a target. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's orders, launched a smear campaign designed to ruin her life. Seberg, who had once hoped to change America, soon found herself in a battle she couldn't win. Carson, who empathized with her desire to speak out against injustice, also recognized the heartbreaking trajectory of her life. The FBI's tactics were chilling, spreading lies about her personal life, fueling her isolation. The pressure was unbearable, leading to the heartbreaking death of her daughter. Carson, though deeply sympathetic to the pain Seberg endured, also saw how her justified anger evolved into something more dangerous. a visceral rejection of the very country that had once embraced her. The cycle of persecution leading to bitterness and ultimately self-destruction left Johnny with profound questions about what patriotism truly means. Can you continue to love a country that has systematically destroyed you? Dennis Hopper's career was a whirlwind of rebellion, drug-fueled madness, and counterculture energy. He embodied the spirit of the late 1960s with Easy Rider, a film that captured the deep divides in American society. But for Johnny Carson, Hopper was a fascinating yet disturbing presence. There was no pretense with Hopper. What you saw was what you got. His disillusionment with America wasn't just some act for the cameras. It was genuine. He believed the country was doomed, that it was rotting from the inside out. His apocalyptic vision of America's future wasn't just a critique. It was a grim prediction. Carson respected the counterculture but felt Hopper crossed a line. It wasn't just that Hopper saw America's flaws, it was the way he reveled in the idea of its collapse. His appearances on The Tonight Show were often unpredictable. One moment articulate, the next rambling and erratic. Johnny found him compelling but troubling. The thing that bothered Carson most was the apparent glee with which Hopper predicted the country's destruction, as if he was rooting for it, rather than hoping for its improvement. Then there was Truman Capote, America's literary darling known for his sharp wit, his high society connections, and his searing critiques of American culture. But Carson, who saw Capote as both brilliant and deeply flawed, couldn't help but feel that the writer embodied the very hypocrisy he criticized. Capote, who benefited from the American dream, made no secret of his disdain for American values. From his criticism of the justice system to his public dismissal of Middle America, Capote seemed determined to attack the very people who had made him famous. For Johnny, it was a deep irony. Capote, who had risen to fame thanks to the American public, seemed to think himself above them. His critiques, though insightful, often veered into contempt. Carson found it particularly telling that Capote, despite his celebrity and wealth, looked down on the very people who bought his books and made him a star. For Carson, Capote was the ultimate example of an intellectual who used his American success to distance himself from the very culture that had made him. These names, Wells, Seberg, Hopper, Capote, were part of a broader narrative that Johnny Carson couldn't ignore. They were the celebrities who, despite reaping the rewards of America, turned their backs on it when it no longer suited them. They used their platforms to criticize the country, not out of a desire to improve it, but out of a deeper frustration and rejection. Carson, ever the skeptic, wondered if it was possible to truly love a country that had given so much while simultaneously tearing it apart. And for these stars, the line between criticism and contempt had become dangerously thin. Orson Welles was the prodigy who defined American creativity. A genius whose work reshaped not only film but radio, with Citizen Kane and War of the Worlds remaining cultural landmarks. But over time, his relationship with the very country that made him famous grew strained. Johnny Carson, ever the observer, saw the shift. Welles didn't just grow disillusioned with Hollywood. He became deeply cynical about America itself. According to Carson, Welles was a man who reveled in power but not in the country that gave him that power. There was a tension between admiration for his talent and disdain for his attitude. Johnny had a keen eye for reading people, and with Welles, the story was complex. His early success gave way to a series of professional struggles that led him to Europe, a place where he could escape the system that seemed to reject him. As Welles expressed frustration about America's commercialism and its lack of intellectual depth, Carson began to see a deeper, more pervasive bitterness. A rejection not just of the American film industry, but of the country itself. Johnny appreciated Welles's creativity, but he also believed that Welles's critique went beyond the fair bounds of artistic frustration. It had become a rejection of the American ideals that had given him the chance to thrive. Jean Seberg's story was far more tragic. A young actress from Iowa who catapulted into international fame with Breathless, Seberg became the victim of an FBI smear campaign due to her support for civil rights causes. She tried to use her platform to change America, but instead, America through its government destroyed her. Johnny often spoke of her story, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a representation of how persecution can warp genuine criticism into a deeper resentment. Carson saw Seaberg as someone who began with a legitimate desire to make America better, but was tragically pushed toward hating it, torn apart by the very forces that should have protected her. Her case wasn't just one of political persecution. It was the painful story of how the government's overreach turned what could have been a push for positive change into something far darker. Seaberg's mental health deteriorated under the weight of her experiences, and she died alone in Paris, an apparent suicide. Carson found her story heartbreaking, and it raised profound questions about what it means to love a country that has failed you. Could you still hold on to love for a country that systematically destroyed your life?